Hello ladies and gentlemen, this is Pangolin and Advisor, and I'll be analyzing Horatio's ships. These elegant designs were approved by him personally, and they are the true kings of versatility. While they have their drawbacks, the customization options of Horatio's ships are nearly limitless, and they allow you to truly prepare for any encounter, surprise your enemies during a large-scale campaign by effortlessly and quickly changing your entire flotillas and fleets' desire, composition, goal, capabilities, anything. However, among their many designs, those ships have a few that in my opinion stand out as being the most viable in the greatest number of scenarios, and these are the ones that I'll focus on, as these ships can either be devastatingly effective, or because of how incredibly unusual they are, they can also be your downfall. Before we begin talking about individual Horatio ships, however, I need to warn you about something. If you look at their special faction trait called Price of Perfection, it claims that the industry cost of your ships is higher, but at the same time the damage output of your ships is higher as well. Moreover, there is not a single trait that suggests that your ships should have more health either. I believe this to be a simple UI error, because after triple checking this in-game, I'm absolutely certain that Horatio ships get a 10% bonus to their health pool as opposed to their damage, which appears to be exactly the same as if they didn't have the 10% increase. So I'm pretty sure this is just a UI error, but just keep in mind, Horatio ships are more expensive, but they don't deal more damage, instead they just have more health. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that you will have fewer ships than your opponents, because you will, generally speaking, spend less industry on individual modules that you're going to equip your ships with. It doesn't actually properly add up and doesn't even out either. Your ships are still probably going to be more expensive, but the difference isn't as extreme as it might originally appear to be. But still, do take caution not to have too many scratches on your gorgeous designs. We shall begin by looking at the attacker ship for the Horatio fleet, as always. Nicknamed the weapon, it is in the Marchio or Marchio-class we'll take a look at first. Marchio is quite an unusual design, and it will showcase the true uniqueness of Horatio fleet in the fact that they value versatility above all else. In fact, Horatio value versatility to such an outstanding degree that they are even willing to sacrifice their actual modules. As you can see, this ship only has 1, 2, 3, 4 module slots, whereas every single other attacker ship in the game right now has more than that. The standard lowest amount of modules on an attacker ship is 5, with some rare examples having more than that. Horatios are the only ones below that number at 4, but in order to compensate for that weakness, they have very smart, well thought out designs that allow them to somewhat make up for the fact that their ships will be objectively weaker because of the number of modules they can install. So first of all, let's have a quick look at those modules. They have one dedicated broadside weapon mount, one weapon/defense mount, also broadside, and one top-mounted weapon/defense/utility module. They also have a defense/utility module as well to accompany the others. In total, this is actually not bad. Having 3 weapon slots on a standard ship is certainly nothing to scoff at. I do appreciate that. The issue is that then they only have 1 defense module or 1 utility module, which is quite weak, all things considered. If I were to give you my personal recommendation, I would say that the best idea I can think of for this particular ship is to simply skip defenses altogether and just research damage amplifiers and give this ship a damage amplifier, making it a glass cannon in its truest sense. It will literally have no defenses whatsoever, but it does have more hit points than other attackers in its class, meaning that it can hopefully survive for long enough to unleash its quite substantial firepower to destroy other opponents. Against other unupgraded attackers, it does have a few decent enough matchups. It should win against Umbra-class and Volter designs. Cravers and Unfallen attackers are also fights that are potentially tricky for you, but they're definitely winnable as well. Finally, the gap between your design and that of the other attacker designs isn't as great as you might think, and you should do fine against ships like the Empire's attackers, for instance, but do not accept great trades, as you will not be getting any. Let's have a quick look, however, at what happens if you upgrade your attackers. An upgraded attacker gains access to extra 2 dedicated defense slots, much needed for this ship, as well as a blank module where you can install either weapon utility or defense, which is as well top mounted, which I do appreciate quite a great deal. So the question becomes now, is the upgrade itself worth it? Well, let's see what we get for the package. If you were to, for instance, treat this ship as a standard attacker, just give it as many weapons as you can, then give it the proper damage amplifier, and then give it as many defenses as you can still fit on it, you get a ship that is decent, but not necessarily worth its cost. However, if you go for a different approach, let's just uninstall everything. I wish there was a button for that. You could, for instance, and this is an interesting idea, just fuel this ship with as many boarding pods as possible, then give it a few more defenses than you otherwise could, which allows you to ignore the utility slot altogether. It is an interesting idea, but by the time you reset boarding pods, you will probably have access to better ship designs. So I would say this is an idea only to be used in certain scenarios, and this is certainly not something you should plan ahead for, at least in my mind. All in all, I would say that the upgraded version of your tanker ship will only win out against the Craver and Umbra-class designs because of your health pool advantage, and you will also win against Volter design because you have superior weapon placement with 2 of your weapons placed at the top of the ship. You will lose out pretty much against anything else because you simply do not have enough modules to compensate for your shortcomings and for the enemy's strengths. Now, honestly, I will say that your fleet has better other sources of damage, so I wouldn't bother upgrading the attackers altogether at all. I would still get the basic design for the early game because you probably want to get Horatio protectors no matter what, and the attacker design comes as a package with the protector design as well, so you get some use out of the unupgraded version, but I am not too sure if it is worthwhile at all to bother upgrading this guy. Now, one interesting side note I should also mention is that if you really wanted to, you could make this ship to be extraordinarily tanky. In fact, it would be the tankiest attacker ships out of all attacker ships, with the exception of Sophon attacker, which would be equally tanky to this guy. My question is, why on earth would you do that? There's no reason to do it, it's just hilarious. So I thought I would mention it. The next ship we need to discuss is the one that performs the role of a protector in Horatio fleet. Nicknamed the Tool, we're going to talk about Baro-class next. As you can see, Baro-class, just like the attacker ship, only has 4 modules, which again puts it at a deficit compared to all other designs. However, while it might initially turn you off, make no mistake, this ship is an instant turn on. First of all, let's talk about its modules. It has 1 dedicated utility slot, 1 defense/utility slot, and 2 defense utility/weapon slots, 1 top mounted and 1 broadside. So if you were to put any weapons on it, it would have decent enough arc of fire. However, take my word of advice and don't do that. Because who cares about this ship not having any weapons? It's a protector. It's supposed to protect your ships or to be a support for your fleets in and out of combat. And guess what this ship is great for? It's great for entirely all of those purposes. If you want the ship to be great out of combat, you can just fill it with as many non-combat utility slots as you want. Do you want your ship to be great in combat? Okay, sure, no problem, just give it a bunch of defenses and then some kind of module that will draw power, or rather attacks from other vessels onto it, or maybe let it repair, or maybe just use that as an extra utility module. All you want to do is pretty much yours too. The sky is the limit. This ship is great in and out of battle. It's also a very good tank. In fact, out of all unupgraded protector ships, only 3 other protector designs are equally tanky to yours. But that is not all, as we have also to talk about the upgraded version of this ship. If you upgrade this ship, you'll get an extra dedicated defense slot, an extra dedicated utility slot, and finally a defense/utility slot. This in turn makes it one of the 4 tankiest protector designs in the game, allowing it to survive an unparalleled amount of enemies' firepower, making it truly magnificent and an impenetrable wall for your enemies not to be able to shoot through. Truly amazing, this ship can again, just like its unupgraded version, performs a variety of roles in and out of combat and do pretty much anything you want with it, which is absolutely amazing. I personally believe that they are amazing tanks and they will be great at making sure that the rest of your expensive fleet survives any engagement. Now, I do have to warn you about one thing. First of all, it, in my opinion, doesn't matter that this ship doesn't have any flak. If you really wanted to, it can have some flak against enemy missiles and boarding pods, but I'll say that you can also designate other ships to perform the same role. You don't have to use your protector ships for it, and I don't think it's a good idea to do so either. However, it does have one weakness. If you put no weapons on the ship at all and just fill it with utility, defense, or the mix of the two, then it means that this ship doesn't do any actual damage. Which, while it is still fine, it does mean that in certain scenarios, this ship can become borderline useless. So, I'll just make it clear right now that you should absolutely stop relying on those ships as tanks. If the enemy spams carriers, as carriers will ignore your protectors altogether, or if the enemy has powerful coordinators that again will ignore your protectors. So, for instance, if you fight against Vodiani or Lumeris, I'll say that relying on this ship to be an impenetrable wall for your fleet could end with your fleet being utterly destroyed, so take that into account. Against other fleets, however, this ship will do quite great in pretty much any configuration, and I do like it quite a lot. If you believe that Horatio's small ship designs are weird, you haven't seen anything yet. The Hunter class for the Horatio, nicknamed the Imperator, is of the Dux-class, and it looks like a centipede on the field of battle because of how much it wiggles. It must be a true nightmare to pilot, but it is very stylish, I'll give it that. True respect points for this guy. It also has, typically for other Horatio vessels, a lot of versatility, but one less module than it is considered standard for other unupgraded hunters. It only has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 modules, whereas the standard amount is 8. However, it can field a surprisingly big amount of weapons, because it has 2 dedicated weapon modules, 1 broadside, 1 top-mounted, and 3 blank modules where you can have anything but a squadron, 2 of them being broadside, 1 I don't know what because it doesn't display for some reason. Nevertheless, you can have a weapon installed on them, bringing you to a total amount of 5 weapon modules. It means that there are 2 other hunters in the game that can match your firepower. They belong to Hishio and Riftborn, with the Riftborn being able to actually have even more firepower than you do. However, you have to keep in mind that in order to stay competitive, you definitely need to use a weapon damage amplifier. And that leaves you with just 1 lonely defense slot, which you will most likely just use for some plating and then rely on flotilla shielding for all of your shielding needs. This is a standard design you could go with if you were to go for this ship, and it will dish out a very good amount of damage. But this will unfortunately be hindered by its lack of defensive modules, and I can only promise you victories against Vultures and Baro-class hunters, I'm sorry. I know it doesn't sound great after looking at so many weapons, but you have to keep in mind that you have an alternative. If you don't want to use a kinetic enhancer and instead use a little bit more shielding, then what you could do instead is just install a lot of boarding pods, and this is my preferred method. With 5 boarding pod launch bays, you'll be a true nightmare and a terrifying force for anybody you face. You just appear on the battlefield, fire a bunch of boarding pods, and steal the enemy fleet for yourself. Your ship also has a decent amount of hit points, more so than its competition, and with 2 defense slots, you should be able to outlast your opponents as your crew takes care of the enemy from the inside. Now, this tactic does require you to have a lot of manpower, which can sometimes be tricky to acquire, but if you can pull this off, this is a very devastating ship design, one that can allow it to overcome the weakness of the Horatio of having no dedicated utility slot module for your weapon amplifier. Truly fearsome design. It is very fun to use at least once in a while, and I definitely believe that it is not a wasted technology point to research a hunter ship, regardless of which weapon design you go for, because at the end of the day, 5 dedicated weapon mounts can be quite devastating even against otherwise more fearsome opponents. What happens if you upgrade this bad boy, however, is a good question that I'll answer right now. As you can see, and as always, you will get an access to the large weapon module mounted at the top, a defense/utility module, much needed, and a dedicated defense slot as well. This in turn allows you to create a ship that still has its signature incredible firepower. So if we just max this out to show you, this is quite beautiful and gorgeous and amazing to look at, but this ship still lacks from its total amount of modules, though as you can see, upgrading does make you a little bit more well-rounded. If you were to go for a regular approach, this ship would definitely win against Baro-class and Vultures designs because of its better weapons placement as well as its extra hit points. However, you should have an equal-ish engagement against Sophons and Cravers, and maybe, just maybe, you can take Unfallen down as well, although this is getting riskier and riskier as we progress along this list. However, you could also consider making the ship a little bit less of a glass cannon. Keep in mind that Horatio get an extra bonus to their hit points, so if you were to make this ship even more survivable and then just lower the amount of damage it can dish out, but in this case it would be still better to have an amplifier instead of a weapon, right? I believe so. Yes, it is better to have an amplifier. So by going with this particular design, you still dish out an okay amount of damage, but you can make a really good use out of your bonus to hit points, so it depends on your personal needs. If you need ships that can survive a few more volleys, this is a better design. And of course, do not forget that all of this still doesn't mean that you cannot perform the good old strategy of spamming boarding pods. It does mean that your large weapon module is wasted. You can use it to you can just treat it as a flak cannon, but unfortunately the flak effectiveness of a kinetic weapon doesn't scale up on a heavy weapon module. So this weapon is as efficient as flak as this weapon, even though in direct combat this weapon deals more damage. But as flak it is actually not in any way better, so you're kind of wasting resources. But it's still extra flak for your fleet to have. Alternatively, you can just go for extra laser weapons, because the enemy will defend against your boarding pods with flak weapons, so they will be probably more vulnerable to dedicated energy weapons. That being said, one large energy weapon is not going to make a very big difference to you anyway, so if you just want to spam boarding pods, I think the basic design of the ship is good enough already. And I say that in many situations it's probably a decent enough idea to skip upgrading this hunter and just rush for the carrier technology and use your carriers as damage dealers instead. However, the base version of this hunter is great to have and important to get because it allows you to steal enemy ships in middle game, allowing you to effortlessly increase the power of your own fleet through combat, which is quite important, and which is why I would say that even though you sink a lot of extra research, or rather science, into getting the unupgraded version of the hunter, it's still a good idea to have. At the end of the day, this ship, even in its upgraded version, can still have a lot of weapon mounts, and it's still quite fearsome in its initial volley. So if you notice that the enemy doesn't have flak or armor, then spamming boarding pods or missiles can give you excellent effects, because the enemy will not have the time to punish you for having little armor. Every good fleet will need some form of support. You already have your protectors, but what about your coordinator? Nicknamed the Upholder, the Archidux, or however I'm supposed to say that, class, is the next thing we need to discuss. And again, as always, this ship has one less module slot than its competitors for other factions. One or less, depending on the competitor. However, it still makes a very good use out of the modules it does have. Now, it has a dedicated blank module, I will call it, where you can install anything you desire. It also has a weapon slash squadron slash utility module. It also has 2 defense slash utility modules, 2 dedicated utility modules, and finally a dedicated defense module. Now, of course, you could theoretically install some weapons on this ship, but I believe that this would be a waste, and it will take away from what is the true purpose of this ship. And this ship's purpose is to be an incredible support ship. It can support you on the field of battle, it has enough support, it has enough defense modules to make that happen. With just 3 of them, or 4 maybe if you want to, this ship is very tanky, and with the extra Horatio bonus to your HP, it will be difficult to take down. So then you can install any other modules you see fit in order to tank some damage for your colleagues. Or if you don't want this to be a tank or just a battle support, then you can install other types of support utility modules. Finally, you can just ignore this ship's combat purpose and just make this a purely out of combat ship, and this will yield you amazing results. Because if you count the amount of utility slots you can fit on this ship, you realize that this ship can have the most utility, actually they're called support, whatever, the most support modules out of all unupgraded coordinator ships that are currently in the game. And this is quite incredible. Just give it all of this and now your fleet is super fast. Or instead replace this with invasion modules and you can conquer anybody in like one evening or whatever. It is magnificent, truly, almost like Horatio himself. Upgrading this ship gives you access to a large weapon mount, a utility, dedicated module, and another blank spot. Or rather, blank module. Blank spot is something entirely different. Nevertheless, if you really want your coordinator to actually be able to dish out some damage in combat, then I suppose you could do so. If you were to install some squadrons, for instance, maybe some kind of interesting large weapon mount or whatever, yes, you can do that, but you have to realize that by this point you have a few defense modules and few utility modules to use after that, so you won't really have a lot of utility left, and you will have a laughably small amount of defense. In fact, if you go this route, you'll be one of the less defended coordinator ships. However, there is still merit to going this route, I'll fully agree to that. But as you will be able to bypass the enemy's tanks and go straight for the enemy's meat, so if the enemy is spamming some weak attacker ships that are defended by powerful protector or coordinators, then you could go for something like this-ish and have decent enough results, I suppose. However, I believe that again, this is distracting you from what the ship is truly best at, and that is just pure, unfiltered support. Either in the battle, or most importantly, out of battle. And I don't like making this ship vulnerable because its amazing health pool means that it really wants to shine as a tank. But the amazing thing about this ship is that it has so many options that no matter what you choose, you cannot really go wrong with this ship. Personally, I am of the opinion that it is perhaps not a bad idea to skip the upgrade, save the resources you would have to spend on this ship, and go straight for your carrier. Since either way, an upgraded coordinator is going to be a fine enough support ship. If you really need something that will focus fire on enemy attackers and hunters, then you can, in that situation, upgrade this guy and then give it some decent enough bombers, fighters, or weapons, depending on what you choose to go for. Finally, it is time to talk about the ship I was teasing you with all this time. The carrier, nicknamed the Exactor, probably because it is exactly like he wanted it to be. It is the Imperator-class that we have to take a look at next. As you can see, this design again suffers from the same problem that other Horatio designs suffer from, in that it has actually fewer modules than other carriers of its sort, which is very unusual because there are almost no carriers that diverge from the usual number of 10 standard modules, but this one actually does, which is quite unusual. So it does have one less, it only has 9, but it's what it does of the remaining 9 that's important. And the important thing is, it can have a lot of weapons. In fact, it can have 5 weapons in total, making it one of the 4 most damaging carriers in the game right now, which is quite impressive. But let's not get ahead of ourselves and talk about the particular modules you can install. This ship has a large top-mounted module, as well as one weapon/squadron module at the side, weapon/defense/utility module at the side, and 2 blank modules. In addition to that, it also has 2 defense/utility modules, a dedicated utility module, and a dedicated defense module. All in all, like I said, constitutes to making this ship into a very powerful weapon of war that can have a lot of weapons installed upon it. Especially with the damage amplifier, it can be quite fearsome indeed. And it also has an okay amount of defense, I would say. That should go somewhere else. There we go. The only issue, obviously, with with designing it the way I just did, is the fact that it is somewhat glass cannon-y. However, because of the Horatio bonus to health points, it still can survive quite a few volleys, and the amount of damage it can dish out in return is quite significant indeed. You should win against most other carriers with this design despite having fewer modules. Cellphones, United Empire and Horatio are probably the only ones that can truly best you, despite you obviously having the disadvantage of having fewer modules. One thing to keep in mind is that in terms of defense modules, you probably care about armor more so than anything else, because armor in particular gives you even more health points, allowing you to just max out that health points. But of course, this often depends on what you are facing. Sometimes it would be stupid not to go for shields, but keep in mind you have a percentage bonus to your overall hit points, which is quite important. Upgrading the Imperator-class brings you bad news, however. It does get the extra large weapon slot, an extra broadside weapon/squadron slot, and also a defense/utility module and a blank module. But if you look at the raw numbers, it actually gets fewer modules with an upgrade than other carriers, meaning that it's not 1 module behind now, but 2 modules behind other upgraded carriers. which does put it at a fairly big disadvantage in some ways. But in other ways, you look at this ship and then you fill it with joy. Like for instance, the missile variety of joy. And then you realize, hey, I have a lot of missiles, I have a humongous amount of firepower. I am terrifying for my enemies, and this is absolutely true. Horatio's upgraded carrier is a monstrosity, only bested by its own beauty and elegant design, obviously, as Horatio himself would want it to be. The only tougher and meaner ships than yours are United Empires and Sophons, since they can actually brag about having the same firepower than you, but not more firepower, only the same amount of firepower. He shall also deserve respect, I suppose, as they have a better weapon placement than you do. But you're pretty awesome and you have a very good match against other carriers, but also don't get too cocky. Despite your beauty, if you face Riftborn on Unfallen Designs, for instance, it will not be a walk in the park for you by any stretch of the imagination, and you can feasibly lose against even other inferior designs if they have researched high-tech support modules. So at some point in the late game area, you're going to probably struggle in keeping your ship as relevant as it is when you research the upgrade for the first time, but nevertheless, it is absolutely a ship that is worth researching and upgrading, and it will reign supreme throughout the late game. Yes, after late game in end game, things will go a little bit more dire, so this is all the more reason for you to secure victory for yourself earlier in the game and make good use out of those powerful machines of war as quickly as possible and achieve dominance. As always, at the end of it all, we'll need to talk about your civilian vessels. Beautifier is your colonizer ship, and it's of the Crazy class, whereas your exploration ship is usually nicknamed Revealer, and it's from the Commons class. Let's have a look at both of those. Starting with the colonizer, the beautifier. It's interesting in its design that it has 3 defense/utilities modules, which means that for the most part you're probably going to just use one of those modules to colonize things and then just make the ship as fast as possible to spread your beauty across the galaxy, which is quite important. But unlike in many other examples for other factions, you don't really need to bother using this ship as a scout ever. This ship is only here to transport your beauty, but for scouting places where you want to bring your beautiful self, you can use your scout ship. That's not the one, the Commons class scout ship, and it will do quite great. This is an upgraded version. Usually unupgraded versions have 1 less support modules, but it still has exactly what it needs. It has 1 dedicated utility module, 2 defense/utility modules, and also a weapon/utility/defense module, meaning that even in the early game, as soon as you start the game, you can just give this guy, for instance, 3 engines and a probe module, and suddenly you're great. You have very speedy ship that can also explore curiosities and send probes to explore more of the galaxy. You can instead have even more speed on this monstrosity, or you could have it be more reasonably fast, but still very fast, and just have more probes so it can scout even more effectively. It is absolutely amazing, and actually, in my eyes, it's one of the highlights of the Horatio. And as the Horatio, you definitely should try to go for exploring as much of the galaxy as quickly as possible, find the races to assimilate into your empire, and then gene splice them to make your own faction better. You have to keep in mind that Horatio's affinity allows you to get the best of other factions' racial traits and improve your own population with this. And in order to find the best candidates to do that, you'll use those ships and they'll perform the role greatly. Such excellent design seems like it must have come from the head of Horatio Prime himself. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I'll sign off. I do apologize for the long break I took between making this video and the previous one, but I got a bit ill. There were other things that I needed to attend to, such as, for instance, a wedding, not my own, somebody else's, from my family, but nevertheless I was rather busy with other things as well, so apologies for the long delay before this video could go live, but now I'll try to have the remaining factions covered in regular uploads. So one last thing I also would like to mention is that Horatio were chosen on Twitter as the next faction for me to cover, so if you do not follow me on Twitter, you probably didn't vote on that, but most people voted for me to cover Horatio next, and that's what I did. And because of this vote, I now know what order I want to cover the remaining factions in, so I'll get right on that. That's all from me, thank you very much for watching. It was Pangolin Advisor, also known as Pan Chasso, and I'll see you online.